All right. I'm going to share my screen and just be flipping back and forth between some documents. Um, and so let me just log into something real quick here. What I wanted to start with, again, maybe some diagrams I had put together in the past when my team was first kind of stood up and working on the different billing related ingestions to build out the Geico Data Hub. Some of these might look a little bit busy at first, but just wanted to, again, kind of orient us on the systems that we're talking about and some of the data and kind of some of the relationships between systems. So this is one diagram that I had put together a while back that was kind of meant to show sort of a front end to back end view of the world. And I've kind of tried to demark, certain levels of like the front end applications. And this would be the way some of our customers or counselors interact with our systems, like through our Edge UI or through the Geico mobile app, or even through something like our interactive voice response service. If they call a Geico number, these are all, you know, interfaces into our core systems, which is really where you see things like policy, which is policy admin system where all the details about a customer's policy live, including all the vehicles and the coverages and the dates and the drivers and all the information that actually makes up the product they're buying for coverage for a given term. And we also then have policy talk over to the billing system, which we're going to focus most of our conversation around billing. But the idea here again is to kind of mention that the front end interfaces like sales or customer service are going to be really interacting with core systems that are really the main anchors of our business model. So whether that's the policy admin system, which is where again when you buy a policy, that's really going to be where you start with getting that policy issued as a new business, and it's going to have properties of term start and end dates. It's going to have vehicles and coverages and prices associated with those. So this system and some of the stuff I don't show in this high level chart would be things like interacting with other systems like our rating, pricing, underwriting systems. That's all kind of assumed in the understanding that policy is the system of record for the policy, and then it has to talk to other applications that are involved in actually pricing the risk, underwriting it, deciding which company and which tier placement to put it in, which is going to determine the pricing and things of that nature. And all of that ends up, again, kind of becoming part of an actual issuance of a policy. For the most part, customers, after they buy the policy, their first interactions with us are going to be, making a payment, and that payment is going to come into the billing system when the premium from policy is issued over to the billing system. So all premium transactions start within the policy application, and then they feed into our billing system, a separate system to actually set up a schedule for the customer based on the payment plan they've selected. And then the customer is going to make payments, again, probably through a UI like Edge or Geico Mobile or through the phone. They can interact with a counselor if they need to do it, but a lot of our self-service options nowadays make it pretty easy to make a payment. And, we used to take a lot of checks in the mail and things of that nature. That's a lot less common than digital payments these days, but there's still the concept of somebody mailing us a check payment, in which case it goes into an application. I think we used to have an internal, what was called remittance center, actually located in the Chevy Chase office of Geico, where the mail would come in and we would go through the payment slips and actually scan them and then create a file and send that into the billing system. Nowadays, I think it was a couple years ago, we outsourced the actual remittance function to a vendor. So they're the ones who get our mail, go through it, create a digital file of payments received, and then send that over to Geico for us to then credit the customer's account in the billing system. And I've got this little kind of wrapper around billing called Billing Business Services, or BBS. Billing in particular kind of has a secondary kind of application that facilitates most of its conversations, at least with like the front end UIs. You can see that those lines are coming to and from Billing Business Services, which talks to billing to actually get data to return to the front ends. Or in the case of dealing with our external partners like the banks or the payment processors, that's where BBS is really the one facilitating those conversations and then posting the results of payments or declines into the billing application. Whereas like something like the policy premium coming over doesn't really go through BBS. There's a direct interface between our policy and our billing system, so that anytime a premium bearing transaction is issued, whether it's a new business, whether it's a renewal, an endorsement, a cancellation, all of those things originate within policy and then are fed into billing in order to get the customer's account balance correct and figure out then what they owe or what we owe them. And maybe in the case of a cancellation or a decrease endorsement where they've paid more money into the policy than is ultimately earned. Again, that might be in the case of like a cancellation, usually a voluntary cancellation, or maybe a large decrease endorsement. They, remove a vehicle from their policy and they've already paid for that vehicle, then we're going to send them money back out the door. So there's kind of a two-way street there. And then on this side of the diagram, I'm not as much of an expert in kind of the claims area, but I think it's important to show here kind of as part of the core systems that, after a customer buys a policy and they start getting billed for it and paying for it, when they actually need to use their policy to, fix a vehicle or, pay a claim, a medical bill, or whatever it might be that their particular incident involved, that's really where our claims application gets involved. It needs to talk to the policy application to know that the policy exists and that the coverage exists and that it's effective and it's the dates are good and all that kind of thing. There's really no direct interaction today between like claims and billing because policy is sort of at the center of that particular part of the process. So again, when a loss happens and claims handling starts getting involved, then there's a whole part of this picture where there's some interaction with policy, and then there's a bunch of stuff recorded in the claim system itself as far as the nature of the loss and things about how to indemnify that customer, whether it's through a payment to them, through a payment to a body shop, or payment to a medical provider. All sorts of stuff happening in claims that, again, I'm not going to try to get too involved in. But what you'll notice is that, again, these core systems are all kind of shown on the same level here, because then once you get into below that level, you're really talking about kind of mid to downstream or back end type of reporting and applications. So these are kind of internal to Geico, where these systems up top, the front ends are exposed to our customers and counselors, and that's how they interact with our core systems. And then the core systems also, when they create transactions, might have to pass transactions back and forth, like I mentioned in the case of policy issuing a premium that billing needs to know about in order to bill the customer, or it also publishes data downstream in order for us to report internally on things that are happening in these core applications. So in the case of policy, one of the main feeds is really into this premium reporting application. So all the details about the premium, the policy itself, are fed at a very low level of granularity. Like I mentioned earlier, all the vehicles and coverages and drivers and limits and things that correspond to that policy are going to be captured in this premium reporting application. And it is going to be the one responsible for then sending information down into the general ledger to account for those premiums. It goes through this financial processing aggregating step called PRISM. That's not incredibly important for our purposes, but the idea being that data is kind of flowing downstream through this application, which participates in a thing we call intersystem balancing, which is what ISB stands for. And what you'll notice with ISB is that there's these three red lines between the three applications that kind of participate in intersystem balancing of a given transaction. The idea being that when a policy is issued or a premium endorsement is issued, whatever it might be, we already talked about how that needs to make its way over to billing in order to set up the customer schedule and bill them for it. But that transaction might go to this system at a much higher level than it goes here. So billing doesn't really care about vehicles and coverages and drivers and all that. It really cares about the total value of the policy and the dates that it's in effect, so that it can get payments for that policy. And what we would say is build equity in the policy over time. So when you first get your policy issued and you haven't made a payment, you have zero equity in it, which means you haven't, paid anything toward that policy yet. But as soon as you make a payment, you start buying equity in that term. And most of our customers pay like an installment plan. So they might buy a month's worth of equity at a time, and we bill them every month. And so by the time we are earning the premium as we go through time, we're also getting chunks of equity. And as long as they keep paying us, then we'll likely get to the point where we issue a renewal term at the end of their existing term, in which case a new premium transaction comes over to billing, and then we start billing for that renewal term. And in a happy path that would be all we would ever do, is we'd get a sale for a policy, customer would pay us, they pay their full term, then we'd get a renewal term, they'd pay us for that, and we would just kind of keep that cycle going. And then, of course, whenever they actually need to use their coverage for a given loss, that's where this side of the house gets involved. So this is a little more predictable over here, kind of the interactions as we create policies to cover certain periods of time. And then losses are, of course, a little less predictable in terms of whenever an accident happens or something causes the customer to have to engage us and get into the claims process. So intersystem balancing is designed as sort of a third-party observer of these interactions between policy billing and policy and premium reporting. So when a given business case or transaction is created, in addition to actually talking to billing and premium reporting independently, which these lines represent, it checks into this intersystem balancing application. That way, when billing receives that premium, it also checks in and makes sure that it's saying the same thing that policy said. And when premium reporting gets it, it's going to also check in intersystem balancing, and intersystem balancing is going to let it know whether it is agreeing with the same story that policy and billing said for that same transaction. So it's just kind of a secondary control. Whatever controls are built into these interfaces between policy and billing are kind of then backed up by intersystem balancing as a third party kind of observer of those interactions. And so it's just a control mechanism to make sure that we're kind of telling the same story between billing and premium reporting. And there's some things that happen in here too in terms of the timing of when a transaction might post here versus here can be off depending on whether or not there's a hiccup in one of the system interfaces or whatever. For the most part, this is a pretty real-time interaction that the transaction's created, checked in ISB, sent to billing, checked in by billing, sent to premium reporting, checked in by premium reporting, and then everybody's balanced and good within a matter of seconds of the transaction being created. But whenever something goes wrong or gets delayed, that can delay the completion of that business case from a kind of intersystem balancing perspective, which can then also delay when we'll actually report that transaction further downstream for premium reporting, because there's a current business rule that says premium reporting kind of is a gatekeeper. It receives the information, it has to check in, and if ISB doesn't say it's complete or balanced yet, then it won't pass it further downstream to go to the ledger. It'll wait till it gets kind of an all clear from ISB that everything's good with the transaction before releasing it further. The idea kind of being that if something doesn't look quite right or hasn't been balanced, we don't necessarily want to start reporting those premiums to the GL if we think the transaction could be in error or incomplete or something of that nature. So again, policy kind of has a direct line, if you will, to the financials through premium reporting for all those premium details. And this system is also responsible for then calculating what we would call earned premium. So it would get a written amount or a transaction amount. Let's say it's $600 for the 6-month term. Essentially, you're probably going to earn about $100 a month. So that this system is responsible for looking at the dates of the coverage and the amount, total amount of it, and then deciding when and what months the premium will actually be earned. So it creates a schedule showing the months that transaction is going to be in effect and how many dollars are earned in each month based on the number of days in that month and the per day rate by which we earn. So my example, I kind of fudge just to make the math easier to say, oh, it's a $600. I'm going to be paying, earning $100 every month. That's not technically true because months have different number of days. Obviously, February being the shortest, and then even the other months, some have 30, some have 31. So technically, you're earning a little bit different amount every month based on the number of days in that month. On this side of the equation, you have the billing system, which has its own feed to the general ledger as well for accounting, which really goes through this application called General Journal Extended, which is kind of a function of this larger balancing and control systems area, or BCS, which again is independent, really, premium reporting and this other billing reports. These are kind of separate databases that live in the midstream area that different applications talk to. So policy talks to premium reporting, billing really talks to BCS, and specifically records all sorts of activities that are happening in billing in this General Journal Extended table. This is, again, where things like the accounting assignments are made based on rules from the accountants about how they want to actually book different activities that are happening in billing to the financials. Because billing really is a confluence of a lot of different events. It gets the premiums from policy, which kind of says, typically is what the customer owes us. and then we get payments from the customer's bank, which is them paying down what they owe us. So billing is really doing the job of managing the receivable. And it also might add installment fees depending on the customer's pay plan. There are other transactions that can happen in billing. Um, you're going to be able to do like pay plan changes or enroll or de-enroll from our auto payment program, which auto pay is just a branded way of saying kind of recurring payments where you sign up and we go and pull the payment from you each month rather than counting on you. If you're not enrolled in auto pay, we count on sending you an invoice and then having you push a payment to us each month. So we love to get our customers on auto pay because it kind of puts us in control of trying to get the payment rather than hoping that the customer remembers to make the payment each month. So different activities from a financial perspective are sent down into the general journal extended, and there's some accounting and aggregation that happens within BCS, and then that data is fed into the Workday ledger or the general ledger, which is currently in Workday Financials. And then on this side of the puzzle, I mentioned how BBS is really kind of the system of record for what's actually happening in the banking world. So billing is a place where payments go to post. And in that sense, it's sort of a internal recording of what we said happened at the bank. But BBS is really the one that's talking to the bank and figuring out whether the payment was declined or settled or returned, all those types of things that the real world, how that money is traveling around between the customer's bank and our bank. And part of what the role then for BBS is to provide that data for what happened down to this billing reports database. There's some copies of Duck Creek data that, billing data that also come into this database here. And then there's some feeds that come out of that into the financials as well. And you could think about one of the big differences here is kind of posted payments versus deposited payments. And this system is really looking at the world from a midnight to midnight perspective, where this system is really going to be more beholden to the schedule that the banks settle payments with us on, which might be more like 5 or 6 in the evening to 5 and 6 in the next evening. It's not really a 24-hour midnight to midnight view of the world that billing has here. It's really based on when we settle payments with the bank. And that introduces a bit of timing in that a payment might come in at like 10 p.m. at night, and we might go ahead and post that payment, but it's not actually going to go out for settlement until the next day because we've already settled that day's payment at 6 p.m. earlier in the day. So that's where something might not show up in the deposit record until the next day, even though it was posted in the evening of the prior day. And then there's some reconciliations that happen between these midstream systems to kind of capture that timing, because really the same kind of timing can exist on the policy side as well. And so part of what accounting cares about is getting these different feeds from each application to tell the story that each application really owns. Policy owns a story about what's happening with the premiums. Billing owns a story about what's happening with the receivable in terms of payments being made, premiums being posted, fees being assessed. The BBS really kind of owns a story for what actually is happening with the bank as far as whether a payment was declined or authorized or settled. And then there's different accounting clearing accounts in the general ledger where it kind of acts as a control to make sure that a posted payment is also showing up at the deposit list and vice versa. But again, due to the timing that I described earlier, it's not like every system tells the exact same story every day. There is kind of a known, timing and potential errors that can happen between these different feeds. And so there are some controls that are built into this midstream to try to make sense out of that each day that the accounting folks would look at and potentially have to work with somebody to create a bug if something's out of balance or to work with somebody in one of our operational areas to actually post a payment that failed to post or something of that nature. If they see it as deposited and it went into the customer's bank account and got their money, but we failed to post the payment to their bill account, that would be a pretty bad customer service experience where they have money coming out of their bank account, but we haven't given them credit. And then we send them another bill saying you still owe us this. So, there's various controls in place to make sure that the money we're receiving is posted or money that we didn't receive or might be taken back from us in the case of like bank returns is also reflected correctly with maybe a reverse payment in the billing world. to make sure that if we gave a customer credit for a payment and then find out later it was a bad payment, that we can take that credit back and then bill them for the right amount or start a pending cancellation process on them. And then these big orange kind of diagrams represent really where we kind of live here in Geico Data Hub. There's a legacy system called EDW, which is our enterprise data warehouse. That was sort of the landing place for all this data before Geico Data Hub came along in the Snowflake platform. So there's some additional lines that I don't have drawn into EDW. This was meant to focus more on the focusing on the feeds into the Data Hub. So we ingest data from premium reporting. There's actually another ingestion from policy directly into Data Hub. There's ingestion from the customer service systems like Edge into Data Hub. I don't have all those lines here because, again, this was meant to focus really on more of the billing and financial flows. So Team Romulan, which Manas and I are kind of the remaining members of, had built some pipelines into the Geico Data Hub from billing, which is what this green line represents. We've got some data flowing in actually from GJE at this point, which I don't have that line drawn on this. I think we did this after I created this diagram, so I need to update it, but there'd be an ingestion from that GJE data in here. There's some data coming from the billing reports in here. We get data out of premium reporting into the Data Hub, and then there's some other lines from the claims related systems in there. But Data Hub is kind of, again, a repository or a warehouse where all of these kind of operational systems, which is why they're kind of different colors, this is how the business actually kind of functions and how the customers see their data and how financials gets it. And the Data Hub, as an analytical platform, was designed to just sort of be another place where data could land so that we could then do analysis on all these things happening within these different applications, and it allows the data from different applications to be in the same place so that you can then also do much more in-depth and sophisticated analysis than if you just had data from billing or just had data from policy or any of these other systems. The data comes into different raw zones within Data Hub, and then it gets transformed and matured through the conform layer and finally into our presentation layer, which is really where we kind of expose the data to our end users more so. Which actually kind of brings up an interesting point, because I'm not sure how much background you guys have on how Data Hub is set up and those zones that I just mentioned in terms of raw, conformed, presentation analytics. Robert or Praveen, have you guys already kind of gotten a education on that part of it?
Not really, Kevin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. I didn't want to assume too much. I think I had assumed a little bit about that. So I could probably, I don't know if I have a good visual in place to show this right now, but this box that Data Hub kind of represents, if you zoomed in on any of these systems, they obviously get much more complicated under the hood, and you might have many different tables and databases involved in how these applications work. With the Data Hub, you could kind of imagine, if we zoomed in on this box, that what I just described is that all the data entry points here from these ingestions would come into a raw database. And those raw databases, schemas might be set up by the source system that you're getting the data from. So it's very much still application kind of specific. Here's where I got premium reporting data into raw or billing data into raw. Then the next step after getting a raw data in there and making sure the pipeline has provided the records and that you have some sort of balance control between the source system and Geico Data Hub. We then have another layer that we have pipelines to move the data from raw into conformed. And that's kind of the first step in taking raw data that comes in from all sorts of different applications and different formats into a little bit more of a common and standardized format. So you would flatten out data structures if you needed to. You might add certain naming conventions, like putting underscores in between names in a field name or a table name. You might take the opportunity to standardize your data types, to use the same date and time conventions in different places and things like that. So that's kind of the first step in maybe sanitizing the data, deduping it, getting it into a standard flattened format. And then after conformed, that's where we have another pipeline that would bring it into a presentation database. And there in presentation, the idea is that the data is more organized around business functions and concepts than it is around source systems. So maybe you have, and it's kind of mentioned here and I skipped over it, but I have policy as being both peak and clear and billing also beam and clear. Well, what that really means is that we have two different kind of high level product lines that are in different applications. And this diagram illustrates that a little bit better. Our commercial auto is in a separate policy application than our personal lines auto. So when you hear the term peak, that refers to the policy system for the personal lines. And if you hear clear, that would really refer more to the commercial auto side. And then same way with billing, there is a billing system for commercial lines that's built on a Duck Creek product. It's a vendor product. And that same Duck Creek product is actually used for personal lines billing, but it's a separate instance than the commercial one. So they're very similar because they're all Duck Creek systems, but the commercial one came along a little bit later than the personal lines one. And there's some nuances in how commercial auto works versus the personal lines that I guess decided to, instead of trying to fit it all into the same applications, they spun up different instances of policy and billing for commercial. And then you'll notice that commercial has its own premium reporting, personal has its own premium reporting. The clear billing actually feeds into a separate general journal extended from the personal line. So some of the stuff that's kind of grouped together for simplicity in this higher level view is actually a little more complicated when you look at different instances of those same applications. And this actually illustrates a little bit more about the maturation of the data from the raw zone where the ingestions come into conformed, into presentation, which is where our end users would interact with it, and the data is more organized around functions like billing, for instance. So all of that was to explain that while I might have separate ingestions from commercial billing, from personal billing that would land in different raw schemas, by the time I put it in a presentation, I'm probably putting it into a common schema called billing, where I care less about what the source system was, and I'm trying to be more business centric and minded in presentation, so that as different applications come and go and different systems might be retired and new ones brought in, that's going to certainly change the applications that are providing data and maybe some of the data formats, but it shouldn't necessarily change the business functionality of that data and those systems if they do the same functions like billing or policy or claims or whatever. So that's part of what traveling up through these different zones in GDH would do. And then there's kind of a final zone in Geico Data Hub called Analytics. I don't know if it's necessarily considered final, but it's generally built off of presentation data, which has been sort of cleaned up, sanitized, made to look more business friendly. But I know there are some use cases where analytics might get data from conformed as well. That's traditionally where you're going to actually see things like our Power BI reports and applications are usually built off of analytics models rather than presentation. And with billing, certainly, and I don't know if this is the rule of thumb necessarily, but the presentation data is generally at a lower level or the lowest level of grain from a given application. And then analytics will often be places where you might start aggregating the data in order to make it more user friendly and more consumable by a Power BI application that might be a chart or some displays for executive level folks that aren't interested in every single policy transaction and whatnot, but maybe they're interested in the overall trends of policy transactions, or they're not looking at every single payment that posted yesterday, but they want to know how many payments in total posted yesterday by each type. That might be kind of some of the difference you would see between the granularity in presentation and some of the summarized data you might see in Power BI from the analytics models. Let me pause there quickly. Logan, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to better explain Data Hub movements or anything you want to just kind of add in general at this point.
No, I think your summary of at least how the data is flowing within the Geico Data Hub area was a good summary. And I don't necessarily have anything to add on your billing overview. I don't know if you had other topics to cover, but I think it would be interesting if you could kind of draw the parallel there to some of like the PDM work that's being done. But but if you had other topics that you still wanted to go through, that doesn't have to be today.
No, I think I can probably kind of touch on that because I did want to explain maybe a little bit about why this box is down here. And one of the reasons that I mentioned in this diagram, EDW kind of existed way before Data Hub, and this used to be kind of the endpoint for a lot of data from these different applications. And then when Data Hub came along, it was sort of intended to eventually retire EDW and migrate us to this new platform and redo some of the ways that we bring data into our warehouses and do analytics on it. But because there's a lot of legacy and past reports and processes that are dependent on EDW, you'll notice that in this chart here, what I showed was that until Data Hub is really fully mature, it might not be possible to really retire the legacy enterprise data warehouse. So for the time being, instead of some of these ingestions going straight to EDW like they would have in the past before Data Hub was there, some of them have now been routed into Data Hub, and then that data still goes out of RAW into EDW to kind of continue supporting those legacy reports and processes that happen within the enterprise data warehouse that are still being maybe developed and built out here in the Data Hub model. So what Logan was kind of mentioning there is that there's some work on a premium data mart that had started really within Enterprise Data Warehouse, because back before premium reporting was feeding Data Hub here, it was also providing data into EDW. EDW was calling back to the policy system, get additional details for every transaction. The premium reporting talked about it. So there's a lot of premium reporting data here that also exists here now. And some of the use cases that Logan's team and Tab's team have been supporting over the last, I don't even know how many months or years at this point, are still being developed off of EDW. And I think some of the grand goal, though, is really that EDW as a separate platform goes away. So this might be based on like IBM DB2 platform right now, and to migrate a lot of what lives in EDW actually into Geico Data Hub, so we can officially be done with our IBM contract to get rid of a separate platform, and then have kind of all of our reporting and use cases supported by the newest Data Hub. One of the other things that's happening here that I didn't really capture in this diagram is that all of these databases in Geico Data Hub as of now, or I guess maybe not as of now, but as of, let's say, last year, were all based on Snowflake. And one of the kind of company initiatives that came along was to get as many open source software solutions stood up as possible, so that we could stop having to have as many dependencies on vendors and stop having to worry about as many paid contracts and things of that nature. So I think it's a bit of a cost-cutting approach, as well as an idea to get rid of some of the dependencies on vendors that we've traditionally had. So some of this stuff, like the raw zone, is actually going to sort of be redeveloped in Azure Data Lake, and then still interact with maybe presentation database in the Data Hub. So in the future world, you could maybe start dividing this Data Hub box up a little bit more to say, okay, well, maybe the raw and conformed zones are actually going to be supported on a different platform, not on Snowflake, but the same concept, that the raw data from all these different functional and operational systems flows into that data lake. Same type of thing you might do with conformed in terms of sanitizing the data, deduping it, standardizing it. And then in the intermediate term, those tables in ADLS will still be exposed to Snowflake in presentation, and where the analytics stuff is still built off of it. And then in the long term, I think they want to get out of Snowflake altogether. And so both presentation analytics and related reports and applications built off of those data sources would be migrated to some sort of open source solution as well. So if you hear the acronym OSS, that's kind of referring to the open source software solutions that are currently being piloted and put into place for some of the data sources have already started migrating. Billing and premium reporting financial stuff hasn't yet quite got to that point. That's likely going to be work you guys will all take on in 2025. Robert, Praveen, any questions or thoughts about what I've shared so far? Does some of the hopefully relationships between systems make sense? The general idea of data flowing, downstream and into our warehouses.
I think it's straightforward, and I will look into it one more time again just to be clear more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the idea with some of the next working sessions again would be to start zooming in on this diagram a little bit, maybe looking specifically at premium reporting and some of the tables and data elements that are captured there, what that pipeline looks like into Data Hub and what we do with the data. We'll spend a lot of time on billing because that's one of the primary pipelines that Team Romulan had developed. There's some requests out there for additional information from this BBS application into the Data Hub that we're working on. Right now, you'll notice that there's no direct line with this green line between BBS and Data Hub. So any of the data that we do ingest into Data Hub from BBS actually goes through this kind of intermediate billing reports layer before it gets to Data Hub. And you'll notice that instead of following that model for the billing data, which a lot of the billing data comes into billing reports and could have just been extracted to go into Data Hub. But one of the concepts, again, was to try to get as close to the source as possible for our ingestions and not rely on intermediate systems or separate ETLs. So we don't really want to have to be dependent on this ETL before we could get data into Data Hub from the billing system. So this pipeline kind of represents a direct pull of the data directly from that Duck Creek system that supports Beam and Clear, so that we're not dependent on some of these other systems to report on the activities happening in those systems. And so we'll focus a lot on what we did there with that pipeline, as well as some of the other pipelines we have in place, because there's some different tools and ingestion techniques that are used depending on the source in order to land the data into raw. And then we can, after focusing on some of the pipelines of what we would call source to raw, or if you see the acronym S2R, that would be source to raw, source being, again, the real application within the business context, and then raw being the landing zone for that in the Data Hub, whether that's on Snowflake or in the future state in ADLS. Conceptually, you still have the same thing going on with a source to raw ingestion, and then raw to conformed and conformed to presentation. If you ever hear the term direct to presentation, that really just means conformed to presentation. The reason why we use the term direct to presentation is that there actually used to be another layer in between conformed to presentation called integration, which just added a little more complexity to the Data Hub concept when it was first stood up, that we eventually got away from. So there was a transformation of data from raw to conform to integration, then to presentation. And so when we started going directly from conform to presentation, that's where the whole direct to presentation concept came from. And this is really kind of what the state of the world looks like today in terms of these four kind of main areas within the Data Hub. Yeah, I probably don't have a lot of time to, get into the details of any system yet because I've only got a few minutes left. So this is probably a good, hopefully, again, overview and a good stopping point to just kind of talk about the main applications that are in play, what they do in terms of their business context. Again, in this diagram, you see some of the same redundancy from the other one in terms of the billing business service is really the ones, dealing with our external banking partners, and then it deals with posting payments or reversing them or things of that nature into the separate billing applications that exist for commercial auto versus personal lines auto, auto cycle umbrella. You see how there's different intersystem balancing steps between them. So a lot of parallels between how personal lines work and commercial lines work, but because they are separate systems, they do have separate pipelines for the data. They have different volumes and things of that. Our commercial auto is a substantially smaller line of business right now versus our personal lines auto. And then, like I mentioned, personal lines really does include personal auto, like private passenger vehicles, like, the car you use to commute to or go to the store in, personal cycle, motorcycle, or umbrella, which is kind of a separate type of coverage than, a traditional auto cycle policy. But it is a personal policy that folks that might have assets they want to protect beyond the limits of their auto policy and for other reasons will have a personal umbrella policy. And that is also, again, managed within essentially this side of the house, and it's built in the same application as personal auto cycle. What else? I guess just again to set the stage maybe for future conversations, just finish off the higher level talk. As far as use cases and why we ingest all this data, there's a lot of things happening within billing. That's a touch point that our customers have with us in order to pay their bills. If they don't pay a bill or they bounce a check or something, then billing has to get involved with a process called we call non-pay pending cancellation. So that if billing says you owe me this much on this date, you don't make the payment, it's going to then talk to policy and say, okay, I need you to set this to pending cancellation. And if there's a tightly controlled process that's regulated that says you have to give the customers X amount of days and an official notice of pending cancellation before you can actually cancel their policy for non-payment. So there's kind of a whole song and dance between billing and policy when something like that happens for billing to tell policy to set it to pending cancellation. And if we don't get a payment on that pending cancellation notice, then policy will ultimately issue a cancellation, which then, again, just like all premium transactions, whether they're positive, like a new business, or negative, like a cancellation credit, have to originate in policy and then flow into the billing system. And that's where all the math is done to figure out what the customer's overall balance is based on the payments they've made against the total amount of premiums that we're going to earn on that policy. And then all of these systems eventually have to talk to our financial systems for us to report results. And so that's where a lot of the finance views of this data come into play. So there's kind of like the more operational view of the data. There's these midstream systems that then start capturing it into dates and assigning accounts. And then that stuff eventually ends up here where you actually get financial results from. So I'm going to stop it there, and we'll dig more into some of the actual systems in the next session.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks very much.
I have a quick question. So is there any directory in our team that where we can put all these videos, like for the learning materials or something?
Yeah, I can certainly save this out in a SharePoint folder. I think there's a couple other recordings I've got out there I've done with the team at different points too that might actually be helpful to review. So I'll get that over to you guys after I start organizing.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate
You're welcome. All right, well then I will talk to y'all later. I appreciate the time.